I have spent 31 years inside and around the American national security establishment, from the Army War College to the State Department, from classified briefing rooms at the Pentagon to the office of the Secretary of State, preparing for scenarios that I hoped would remain theoretical. The scenario that arrived at the Strait of Hormuz at 1:33 a.m. is not theoretical. It is operational. It is historical. And I need to tell you what it means before I tell you what happened, because the meaning is the thing that every institutional voice covering this event is going to spend the next 72 hours trying to manage, minimize, contextualize into something less than the threshold crossing that it actually represents. 3 American aircraft carriers are gone: the USS Nimitz, the USS Harry Truman, the USS Abraham Lincoln, struck by 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 hypersonic ballistic missiles in a coordinated attack of a sophistication and a scale that the American naval planning community had classified under the category of scenarios requiring peer-level adversary resources to execute. Iran is not a peer-level adversary by any metric the American national security community has historically used to define that category. It is a sanctioned regional power that built its weapons under embargo, refined its doctrine under isolation, and executed the most consequential naval engagement since Pearl Harbor, with domestically produced weapons designed by Iranian engineers, manufactured in Iranian facilities, and deployed by Iranian soldiers who understood with complete clarity what they were doing and why it would matter. I want you to hold the number 18,000 before I say anything else. 18,000 American sailors and aviators missing in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. Behind that number are 18,000 individual human beings, sons and daughters, parents and spouses, 22-year-old sailors on their first deployment, and 40-year-old chief petty officers on their final tour. They went to sea carrying the trust that the institutions responsible for sending them had assessed the threat environment honestly and prepared them adequately for what they would face. I am going to tell you tonight, with the full weight of my 31 years inside those institutions, behind the statement that trust was broken not at 1:33 a.m., but across years of institutional decisions that consistently chose comfortable assessment over honest engagement with the evidence of Iranian capability development. The 18,000 missing Americans are the price of that choice. I intend to name it plainly. The numbers are these: 2,100 missiles, 3 carriers, 44 minutes and 17 seconds from the first impact to the last carrier's abandoned ship transmission. Those numbers are simple. What they mean for the world that exists on the other side of 1:33 a.m. is not simple at all. What happens in the next 72 hours will determine whether this is the opening engagement of the most destructive regional conflict since the Second World War, or the threshold event that finally forces the strategic reckoning that 30 years of American Iran policy has been successfully avoiding. I have never said that about any event in my professional career. I am saying it now. Stay with me. Before I walk you through the operational anatomy of what happened, let me tell you the 4 questions that I believe every serious person watching this needs to have answered. The first is how 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles simultaneously defeated the integrated defensive networks of 3 separate carrier strike groups operating in coordinated mutual support, and what that operational achievement tells me about the depth of Iranian anti-carrier planning that American naval doctrine failed to model accurately. The second is what the specific attack architecture of tonight's engagement looked like across its 4 distinct phases, how the 44 minutes and 17 seconds were divided, and what the targeting logic of each phase tells me about Iranian operational priorities. The third is what 18,000 missing Americans means for American domestic politics, for the institutional psychology of the national security establishment, and for the credibility of the strategic framework that sent those sailors to Hormuz. And the fourth is what the simultaneous destruction of 3 American carriers means for NATO, for China's Taiwan calculus, for Russian strategic positioning, and for the petrodollar, whose naval enforcement mechanism is now resting on the floor of the Persian Gulf. Every answer is coming. Let me get into it. If you have been following U.S. Watch Truth because you wanted analysis that engages honestly with what the evidence shows, rather than what the institutional machinery wants you to believe is happening, I need you to demonstrate that right now. Hit like. Subscribe immediately if you have not already. Share this video with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what tonight means for the world they live in. And leave your assessment in the comments below, because I genuinely need your thinking on the de-escalation question as much as you need my operational analysis. The community this channel has built makes the analysis better and more complete than anything I can produce alone. Now let us work through this together. From the standpoint of someone who spent a career studying anti-access and area denial doctrine at the highest classification levels available to American military planners, what I am reconstructing from tonight's engagement represents the most sophisticated, simultaneous, multi-target, anti-carrier operation ever executed by any military force against any adversary. I want to be precise about that assessment. It is not hyperbole. It reflects a careful evaluation of what was required to defeat the layered defensive systems of 3 American carrier strike groups operating in coordinated mutual support simultaneously, and what the successful execution of that defeat implies about the maturity and the depth of Iranian anti-carrier capability. The tactical problem that Iran's operational planners faced was genuinely formidable. Each American carrier strike group maintains a defensive architecture specifically designed to defeat missile saturation attacks. The outermost layer consists of Arleigh Burke destroyers and Ticonderoga cruisers equipped with Spy-1 and Spy-6 radar systems and SM-6 interceptors capable of engaging threats at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. The intermediate layer provides additional SM-6 coverage and evolved Sea Sparrow point defense. The innermost layer provides Phalanx CIWS last-ditch defense. Against a single carrier strike group, this architecture is genuinely formidable. Against 3 carrier strike groups operating in close proximity, it creates overlapping defensive fields that theoretically multiply the available intercept capacity against any incoming salvo. Iran defeated this architecture through a combination of factors that had been individually recognized in American threat assessments, but had never been encountered simultaneously at this scale. Understanding each factor is essential to understanding why the outcome was what it was. At exactly 1:33 a.m., the Iranian electronic warfare package that had been prepositioning within commercial maritime traffic transiting the strait for 60 hours activated simultaneously across all 3 carrier strike groups. What I want to emphasize about tonight's electronic warfare operation is its scale. Previous Iranian carrier strikes, I have analyzed targeted single carrier groups with jamming profiles calibrated to 1 Aegis radar configuration. Tonight's package executed simultaneous degraded tracking operations against 3 separate and geographically dispersed battle management networks, requiring distinct jamming profiles for each group's specific radar configuration, executed from distributed, pre-positioned assets. Simultaneously, the coordination required to achieve this tells me that Iranian electronic warfare planning has reached a level of sophistication that American naval doctrine had not adequately credited it with. 45 seconds after the electronic warfare activation, the first wave of 630 Khorramshahr-4 missiles entered the outer engagement envelopes of all 3 carrier strike groups simultaneously. 210 missiles per group timed to arrive at each group's outer defensive perimeter at the same moment, despite the three groups' different distances from the Iranian launch positions. The timing precision required to achieve simultaneous arrival at three geographically separated perimeters from a distributed launch architecture is itself an operational achievement of the first order. What I am reconstructing from the engagement timeline is a combined interceptor expenditure of approximately 800 rounds across all three groups' outer screens, achieving roughly 192 intercepts under the degraded tracking conditions. 638 Khorramshahr-4 warheads penetrated the combined outer defensive envelopes. The first wave destroyed 7 Arleigh Burke destroyers and 2 Ticonderoga cruisers across the three formations, and reduced the combined remaining interceptor inventory to approximately 580 rounds. The second wave of 700 Khorramshahr-4 missiles arrived at 1:44 a.m., again timed for simultaneous arrival at all three defensive perimeters. What distinguishes this wave's targeting architecture from what I would have expected based on earlier single-carrier strike analysis is its cross-group prioritization logic. Rather than distributing the second wave evenly across the three groups, Iranian targeting assigned the heaviest missile concentrations to the highest magazine platforms, regardless of which strike group. Those platforms belong to treating the three groups as a single integrated defensive network and targeting its highest value nodes rather than its three separate components. This targeting logic tells me something important. It tells me that Iranian strike planning modeled the three-group defensive configuration as a networked entity with shared magazine capacity rather than three separate entities with independent defensive capacity, and designed the second wave to defeat the network rather than to defeat three separate groups sequentially. That is a level of doctrinal sophistication in anti-carrier planning that deserves specific acknowledgement against 580 remaining interceptors and 700 incoming missiles under continuing electronic warfare degradation. The combined defensive response achieved approximately 115 intercepts, 585 Khorramshahr-4 warheads penetrated. By the end of the second wave at approximately 1:52 a.m. My reconstruction places the combined remaining interceptor inventory across all three strike groups at approximately 90 rounds distributed across surviving escort vessels, insufficient to provide meaningful defensive coverage for any of the three carriers against what followed. The third wave of 570 Khorramshahr-4 missiles arrived at 1:52 a.m. in three simultaneous sub-packages of 190 missiles, each one directed at each carrier, arriving at each carrier's position at the same moment. Against 90 combined interceptors remaining and 190 incoming missiles targeting each individual carrier, the defensive response was operationally irrelevant. The USS Nimitz received 167 warhead impacts across 14 minutes. The semi-armor-piercing warheads of the Khorramshahr-4 penetrated the flight deck armor layer before detonating, maximizing internal structural damage. The aviation fuel fires ignited simultaneously across multiple deck levels exceeded the carrier's damage control capacity within 4 minutes of the first impact. The Nimitz's nuclear reactors entered emergency shutdown at 1:57 a.m. She capsized at 2:19 a.m. The USS Harry Truman received 153 warhead impacts. The strike pattern against the Truman showed a concentration on the stern quadrant consistent with deliberate anti-propulsion targeting three weapons impacting in tight sequence in the engineering spaces in a pattern that reflects specific structural knowledge of the Truman's propulsion system layout. Immobilized and burning, she transmitted her abandoned ship order at 2:04 a.m. The USS Abraham Lincoln received 171 warhead, impacts the highest impact count of the three carriers, consistent with Iranian targeting, intelligence assessing her as the most defensively capable of the three, and allocating proportionally higher strike resources against her. She transmitted her abandoned ship order at 2:08 a.m. The fourth and final wave of 200 Khorramshahr-4 missiles arrived at 2:06 a.m. to complete the destruction of every surviving surface combatant across all three strike groups. At 2:17 a.m. and 44 minutes and 17 seconds after the first electronic warfare activation, the engagement was complete. Three carriers were gone. The surviving escort vessels of all three formations were accelerating away from the engagement zone on headings pointed away from Iranian weapons range. And 18,000 American sailors and aviators were in the water of the Strait of Hormuz. Let me tell you what the Khorramshahr-4's deployment as the sole strike weapon across a 2,100 missile salvo tells me about Iranian missile production capacity, because the production dimension of tonight's engagement is itself a strategic revelation that I want to address directly and honestly. The Khorramshahr-4 is a medium-range ballistic missile with a hypersonic terminal phase, achieved through a maneuvering re-entry vehicle, executing continuous evasive maneuvers at terminal velocities between Mach 12 and Mach 14. Its active radar terminal seeker homes on the electromagnetic signature of large surface vessels with a precision independent of whatever electronic warfare environment the target systems attempt to generate. This terminal guidance independence is the characteristic that makes it specifically effective as a single system anti-carrier weapon at scale, because it means the electronic warfare component of the strike needs only to degrade the defensive picture. The offensive targeting function is handled autonomously by each individual missile's own seeker. What the deployment of 2,100 production quality Khorramshahr-4 missiles in a single engagement tells me is that Iranian missile production capacity has exceeded every Western estimate I am aware of by a margin that requires explanation beyond simple collection error. I spent enough of my career in and around the American intelligence community to understand how production estimates are generated and what institutional pressures affect their conclusions. The consistent underestimation of Iranian production capacity that tonight's engagement confirms is not a random error. It is the product of analytical cultures that reward assessments consistent with existing policy frameworks and penalize conclusions that require those frameworks to be revised. The 18,000 missing Americans are partly the price of that analytical culture. Washington's response was launched within 4 hours of the final carrier sinking confirmation, and I want to assess it honestly rather than either dismissing it or overstating its strategic significance. Over 200 Tomahawk cruise missiles were fired against Iranian naval base infrastructure, IRGC missile storage, and launch facilities along the Makran coast, and radar and communications installations supporting Iranian anti-access architecture in the Gulf operating area. As a demonstration of American willingness to respond, the retaliation is operationally significant. As a practical constraint on Iran's ability to execute follow-on operations, its effectiveness is considerably more limited than its scale suggests. The targets struck are the fixed infrastructure from which the carrier strike was supported. They are not the weapons that executed the strike, because those weapons have been expended. They are not the mobile launch platforms, the preposition submarine assets, or the airborne launch systems that could contribute to follow-on operations, because those assets are dispersed mobile. and hardened against the kind of fixed infrastructure strike that tomahawks are designed to execute. The retaliation tells Iran and the watching world that America will not absorb this strike without response. It does not tell Iran that America has degraded its ability to conduct follow-on operations in ways that change the operational calculus for the next 72 hours. 3 additional carrier strike groups have been ordered toward the Gulf operating area. I want to say something about that order that I suspect is not being said in the briefing rooms where it was made. Sending additional carriers into the operating environment that just destroyed 3 is not a solution to the problem that destroyed them. The Khorramshahr-4 that sank the Nimitz will sink the Abraham Lincoln with the same efficiency if the Abraham Lincoln enters the same threat environment without a fundamental revision of the defensive doctrine that failed. Tonight, the order reflects the institutional momentum of an organization that responds to carrier losses by sending more carriers because that is the only response its doctrine provides for. The operational planners who drafted the order understand its limitations. Whether the political authorities who approved it understand those limitations is the question I cannot answer from outside the decision-making process. The Hormuz closure question is the variable that transforms this from a catastrophic military defeat into a global economic crisis. Iran has not yet formally closed the strait, but the de facto closure, produced by the sinking of 3 American carriers in the approaches to Hormuz, has already achieved the economic effect of a formal closure. No commercial vessel insurer is currently writing coverage for tankers transiting the operating area. No major shipping operator is currently dispatching vessels into the strait. Oil has moved above $180 per barrel in overnight trading. The trajectory is upward with no credible ceiling in the current environment. Every energy import-dependent economy on the planet is running recession calculations against an oil price shock that will not resolve quickly regardless of how the immediate military situation develops. I want to step back from the operational analysis for a moment and say something about what Iran has actually accomplished tonight that I believe the coverage of this event is almost entirely missing because without understanding it, you cannot understand why the strategic situation is what it is or where it is headed. The 2,100 Khorramshahr-4 missiles that sank 3 American carriers tonight were not purchased. They were not imported. They were not assembled from components acquired through any supply chain that the American sanctions architecture failed to close. They were conceived by Iranian engineers working in facilities built by Iranian workers, manufactured using materials processed in Iranian industrial plants, tested on Iranian proving grounds, and deployed by Iranian soldiers who understood with complete clarity what they were doing and what it meant for their country and their civilization. Every element of the capability that produced tonight's outcome was built under conditions specifically designed to prevent its development. Under sanctions that targeted the technology, the components, the financial transactions, and the international relationships that would have made development faster and easier, the people who built these weapons did so knowing that the international system was arrayed against their effort, that the resources available to them were a fraction of what their adversary commanded, and that the timeline required was measured in decades rather than years. I spent 31 years in an institution that consistently underestimated the depth of that commitment. I want to name that underestimation plainly because I think it is at the root of every strategic failure that tonight's engagement has exposed. American strategic culture is built around the assumption that sanctions pressure produces strategic capitulation, that economic isolation eventually forces the target state to choose between its strategic ambitions and its economic survival. The Iranian experience has empirically refuted that assumption across 50 years of sustained pressure. Tonight's engagement is the most definitive refutation available. A nation that measures its strategic commitments in civilizational rather than electoral timescales does not capitulate to economic pressure. It builds, patiently and systematically the capability required to defeat the power that imposes the pressure, and then it uses that capability. My assessment of what the world looks like on the other side of 1:33 a.m. stated, as directly as I know how to state it, is this. The strategic architecture of American global military dominance has encountered its operational limit tonight and has not survived the encounter intact. That is not a prediction or a projection. It is an assessment of what the simultaneous destruction of 3 carrier strike groups by a sanctioned regional power operating domestically produced weapons has demonstrated to every government, every military planner, and every strategic analyst on this planet. In Moscow, the response is publicly restrained and privately one of genuine strategic satisfaction. Russia has spent 2 decades arguing that American unilateral military dominance is not a stable foundation for international order. The sinking of 3 American carriers by an Iranian military that Russia has supported diplomatically and in some dimensions technically is the most dramatic possible validation of that argument. Moscow does not need to do anything in the immediate aftermath. The implications for every American security commitment globally are already being processed in every capital that depends on those commitments. In Beijing, the calculation is more immediately consequential. The central variable in every Chinese planning scenario for Taiwan contingencies has always been American carrier-based air power. The question of whether American carriers would come to Taiwan's defense has been the cornerstone of cross-strait deterrence. The question of whether American carriers could survive in a threat environment that China could create is now answered by tonight's engagement with a clarity that every Chinese military planner will spend the coming weeks incorporating into their doctrine, their force structure, and their timeline assessments. The petrodollar's structural foundations have received from tonight's engagement the blow that this conflict has been building toward. The naval enforcement mechanism underwriting dollar-denominated energy pricing has been sunk 3 times over in a single engagement. The alternative financial architecture is not a future consideration for Gulf states processing tonight's events. It is an immediate operational necessity. The transition that was already underway has been accelerated by the most definitively consequential single operational event it could have received. 3 carriers, 2,100 missiles, 44 minutes and 17 seconds, 18,000 missing Americans. The numbers are simple. Their implications will reshape the world for the next 50 years. I want to close by doing something that the institutional voices covering tonight's events will not do. I want to acknowledge honestly the degree to which the outcome I have just described is the product of institutional failures that I was part of, that I observed from the inside, and that I did not do enough to challenge when challenging them might have made a difference. The consistent underestimation of Iranian capability, the analytical cultures that rewarded comfortable conclusions over honest ones, the policy frameworks that subordinated threat assessment to diplomatic and political preferences, the assumption that sanctions pressure would produce strategic capitulation before it produced strategic capability. These are not abstractions. They are the specific institutional failures that produced the specific decisions that sent 18,000 Americans into a threat environment they were not adequately prepared for. I name them not to assign blame in the abstract, but because I believe the 18,000 missing Americans deserve to have the institutional failures that produced their situation named by someone with the knowledge to name them accurately. The accountability for those failures will come through the democratic processes that eventually impose accountability on institutional failures of this magnitude. I hope it comes quickly enough to prevent the next iteration. Now let me ask you the question that I genuinely do not know the answer to, and that I believe no honest analyst knows the answer to tonight. Is there a viable de-escalation pathway from this point? Does one exist that both parties can accept without characterizing as capitulation? Or have the events of 1:33 a.m. created a momentum toward total regional conflict that no diplomatic intervention, however urgent and however skillfully executed, can arrest? The 72-hour window is open. The decisions being made inside it will determine the answer. I will be watching every one of them and analyzing every one of them on U.S. Watch Truth with the depth and the honesty that this moment demands. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what tonight means. Hit like, subscribe, turn on notifications, leave your assessment of the de-escalation question in the comments. I will read every response, and the most insightful thinking will shape the next analysis. I'm Lawrence Wilkerson. This is U.S. Watch Truth. Stay with me for what comes next.